The man standing at the edge of his property that September morning looked, by every measurement his neighbors had available, like a fool. His name was Pieter Voss. He had arrived in the Nebraska territory in the spring of 1884, with calloused hands, a Flemish accent so thick you could cut it with a splitting maul, and ideas about walls that no one within 40 miles had ever seen put into practice. He was 31 years old, lean as a fence rail, and completely unbothered by the fact that every man who rode past his claim slowed his horse to stare and shake his head. Because while every other homesteader in Custer County was doing the sensible thing, raising a single log wall, chinked tight with moss and clay, stacked solid against the coming cold, Pieter was building something that made no immediate sense to anyone who looked at it. He was building a second wall, a complete outer shell of rough-sawn boards, standing 12 inches away from his finished log cabin, like a skin pulled loose from the body it was meant to protect. The gap between the two walls was the thing people couldn't stop talking about. 12 inches of nothing, filled with dry prairie hay and cattail fluff, wrapped in woven wire at the base to hold it all in place. The outer boards ran floor to eave, battened at every seam. Under the roofline, Pieter had cut a row of half-inch ventilation slots that nobody understood the purpose of. Over the door and windows, he had hinged outer shutters that could seal tight in a storm or swing open in mild weather, like eyelids on a sleeping giant. The whole structure took him 6 weeks longer than a standard cabin. It consumed over 1,400 board feet of lumber that his neighbors calculated he had no business spending. It sat on his claim, looking less like a pioneer homestead and more like a fortification built by a man expecting a siege that no one else had been warned about. "Pieter's building a fence around his house," said a man named Cord Holt at the Broken Bow Supply Store one Saturday in October. Cord had been on the plains since 1876, had survived 2 hard winters and 1 killing drought, and considered himself a reliable judge of what worked and what was wishful thinking dressed up as ingenuity. The other men around the wood stove laughed at that because it was both funny and accurate, and because laughing felt better than admitting they'd slowed their horses to look. "He's wasting good lumber on dead air," said another man, a Norwegian named Strand, who had arrived the same spring as Pieter and built what was, by every local standard, an excellent cabin, tight walls, deep-set windows, a proper iron stove that would hold a fire through the night. Burke was methodical, experienced, and confident in the methods that had kept his father's family alive through winters in Telemark. He saw no reason to complicate a solved problem. Pieter heard these things. The territory was not a large place, and news of a man's foolishness traveled faster than news of his wisdom. He kept building anyway, measuring his vent slots with the same unhurried precision he gave to everything else, tapping his battens flush, checking the plumb of his outer frame in the early morning light before the wind came up and made everything shiver. What Cord Holt and Strand and every other man shaking his head at the fence around the house couldn't know because they had never been inside one of the ice storage facilities that lined the shipping routes along the Belgian coast, was that Pieter hadn't invented anything. He had remembered something. His father had worked at a commercial ice house outside Bruges for 11 years, cutting winter ice from the canal and packing it for summer delivery to the fish markets of Ghent and Ostend. The operation depended on a simple and ruthless piece of physics. Keep the ice cold through July heat, and you make money. Fail, and you lose everything. The men who built those ice houses had spent decades learning that a single thick wall, no matter how solid, could not stop summer from reaching the ice inside. What worked, the only thing that worked reliably, was a sacrificial outer wall separated from the inner storage chamber by a gap packed with dry sawdust or tan bark or, in a pinch, dry straw. The outer wall took the heat of the day. The packed fill absorbed whatever got through. The inner wall sat in still air that barely moved. And still air, Peter had learned, before he was old enough to swing a maul, was the closest thing to a perfect insulator that a working man could afford. He had grown up understanding something that took building scientists another century to formally codify. It is not mass that insulates. It is stillness. Moving air is a thief. It pulls heat from every surface it touches through a process called convective transfer, robbing warmth so efficiently that a single gap the width of a finger can undermine an entire wall's thermal resistance. But trap that air. Hold it motionless inside fibrous material so it cannot circulate, cannot form currents, cannot carry heat from the warm side to the cold, and it becomes a barrier that mass alone can never match. The prairie wind that swept across Custer County in winter was not simply cold. It was pressurized. It hunted gaps with the patience of something alive, driving through microscopic cracks in chinking, finding the invisible spaces between log and mortar, pushing cold air in on the windward side while simultaneously sucking warm air out through openings on the lee. A single log wall, no matter how carefully assembled, presented hundreds of potential infiltration points to a sustained blizzard wind. The logs themselves became thermal bridges conducting exterior cold directly inward along their length, radiating chill from their inner faces into the room where families slept. Peter had looked at the flat Nebraska landscape that first spring, the wind unbroken for 1,000 miles in every direction, no mountain range to slow it, no dense forest to shred its teeth, and seen the icehouse problem in reverse. In Belgium, the enemy was summer heat trying to get in. Here, it was winter cold trying to do the same thing. The solution was identical: an outer skin to catch the weather's force, a dead air cavity to break its circulation, an inner wall left to exist in a zone of thermal calm that the storm outside could not reach. The mathematics were elegant enough that Peter had sketched them on paper during the Atlantic crossing. 12 inches of loose hay, properly dried and lightly packed, created an insulation barrier with thermal resistance that no single log wall, regardless of thickness, could match against driven wind. The outer planks would suffer. Weather would gray them and split them and eventually work the battens loose. That was the point. Let the outer skin take the punishment. Let it be the thing that wore out, the thing that absorbed the storm's mechanical energy, so the structural logs inside never had to. He explained this to exactly no one because the plains in 1884 had little patience for men who reasoned out loud about physics when there was sod to break and fence posts to set. By the time the first real cold arrived in November, Peter had his outer shutters sealed, his vent slots clear, and 2 cords of split wood stacked under his lean-to in a configuration that his nearest neighbor, a Missouri-born farmer named Walt Decker, found deeply suspicious. 2 cords for a whole winter. Walt had put up 7 and was thinking he might need more. "You'll freeze by January," Walt told him one afternoon, while Peter was adjusting the woven wire screen at the base of his outer wall, making sure the gap between the buildings stayed clear of drifted leaves. Man can't heat a cabin through a Nebraska winter on 2 cords. "I don't plan to heat the outer wall," Peter said without looking up. Walt stared at him for a moment, then rode home and told his wife that the Belgian had gone simple from all the solitary work. The first weeks of winter were deceptively mild, the kind of weather that encouraged men to let their guard down and their woodpiles sit. Burke Strand, whose cabin was genuinely excellent by the standards of the territory, reported interior temperatures of 58 degrees on calm nights with a modest fire. Comfortable, efficient, exactly what a well-built single-wall structure should deliver in mild cold. Cordholt's larger place stayed warm with 2 fires going and a stove that he'd hauled from Kansas City at considerable expense. Walt Decker burned through his first cord by Christmas and told himself he'd been right to cut 7. Peter burned 3/4 of a cord between November and the end of December. His interior registered 62 degrees on the coldest, calm nights, with a fire he could manage comfortably from a single arm's worth of split wood. He noted this in his ledger without comment, the way a man records a measurement rather than a victory. Then January arrived. The storm that hit Custer County on the morning of January 14th, 1885, did not announce itself the way experienced plains settlers expected weather to announce itself. There was no dropping barometer reading 2 days out, no greenish cast to the western sky, no livestock pressing against the south fence with that particular nervous energy that old-timers had learned to read like a newspaper. The day before had been cold but clear, and several men had used the calm to drive into Broken Bow for supplies. They were still on the road home when the sky went the color of a pewter plate in less than an hour. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 40 minutes, and the wind came out of the northwest with a force that bent the dried grass flat and stayed bent. By noon, the blizzard was running at sustained winds above 40 miles per hour, driving snow so thick and fine that it found every gap in everything. It wasn't the large, lazy flakes of a gentle snowfall. It was ice crystals ground fine by 1,000 miles of unobstructed travel across the frozen plains, particles so small they behaved more like smoke than snow, insinuating themselves through cracks that a man's finger couldn't find, building pressure differentials that turned ordinary log walls into bellows, pumping cold into the spaces where families lived. Walt Decker felt it within the first 2 hours. He had banked his fire well before the storm hit, confident in his 7 cords and his tight chinking. By mid-afternoon, with the wind screaming at every seam of his cabin, he was feeding the stove continuously and watching his interior thermometer refuse to climb above 44 degrees, despite the heat pouring off the iron. He could feel the cold radiating off the log walls, even standing in the center of the room. The logs were acting as conductors, pulling exterior temperature inward along their entire length, while the wind outside maintained constant pressure that forced cold air through every microscopic gap in his chinking. He put on his coat indoors and started calculating how long his wood would last at the rate he was burning it. 2 miles northeast, Burke Strand's excellent cabin was teaching him something about the difference between cold weather and blizzard conditions. His inside temperature had dropped to 38 degrees by 3 in the afternoon, with his stove running hard enough that the pipe glowed red from 8 inches up. Ice was forming on the inner face of the north wall logs, a crystalline rime that grew thicker as warm, moist air from his breath and cooking met the frozen wood surface. The water pail he kept near the stove had developed a thin skin of ice on top. His children were wearing their coats and boots indoors. He was burning wood at a rate that would exhaust his supply in 12 days if the storm held. The physics destroying both men's comfort were simple and merciless. Blizzard wind creates something that calm weather cold does not. Pressure differential. The windward side of a structure experiences elevated air pressure as the storm drives against it. The lee side experiences reduced pressure as air accelerates around the building. This pressure difference turns any gap in any wall, however small, however carefully chinked, into a pathway. Cold air comes in under pressure on the windward face. Warm interior air gets drawn out through openings on the opposite side. The structure breathes in cold and exhales heat continuously, and no fire can burn hot enough or fast enough to overcome that drain without consuming wood at a rate that will eventually outpace any reasonable supply. Cordholt, who had the largest cabin in the area and the most experience, was also burning through his wood at a pace that alarmed him. He had positioned his cabin well, had oriented it to minimize the north face exposure, had chinked it 3 times and considered it sound. But his 2 fires were barely maintaining 50 degrees in the main room, and his bedroom, which shared a wall with the outside, had dropped to 31. His water lines, the simple gravity-fed system he had run from his hand pump to a kitchen basin through a chase in the interior wall, froze solid sometime between midnight and dawn on the second day. He discovered this at 5 in the morning when he turned the tap and nothing came out, and spent 2 hours crouched in the cold with a lamp trying to thaw the pipes before giving up and melting snow in a pot. This was the moment. Frozen pipes in a man's own kitchen, in a cabin he'd built with his own hands and considered more than adequate, while the wind outside showed no signs of stopping. Cordholt was not a man given to dramatic reassessments of his own judgment, but crouched beside a frozen pipe in a 42-degree kitchen while the storm hammered his walls, he found himself thinking about the Belgian and his ridiculous extra wall, and about all the things a man might be wrong about without knowing it. Pieter Voss's cabin, 3 miles due west of where Cordholt's pipes were freezing, was operating according to a different set of physics entirely. The outer plank wall was taking the full force of the blizzard. The battened seams were whistling in the highest gusts, the boards flexing slightly against their ledger blocks, snow packing into the vertical joints and then being scoured out again as the wind shifted. Smoke from Peter's stovepipe, he checked this each morning from his inner doorway before stepping out, was torn away horizontally before it cleared the outer roofline, shredded by wind that had been crossing flat ground since the Dakotas. The outer shell was being used exactly as it was designed to be used, as a sacrificial surface that received the storm's energy so that the structure behind it didn't have to. In the 12-inch cavity between the outer planks and the inner log wall, the loose, dry hay and cattail fluff were doing their work without drama or visibility. The fibrous material had been packed to approximately 3.5 pounds per cubic foot, dense enough to stay in place, light enough to maintain the millions of tiny trapped air pockets that made it thermally effective. Each individual strand of hay created a microscopic barrier around the air it enclosed, preventing the convective circulation that would have allowed that air to carry heat outward. The whole mass was, in the language Peter had absorbed from a decade of watching icehouse operators work, a cold buffer, a zone where the storm's thermal aggression was absorbed and neutralized before it reached anything of structural or human importance. The inner log wall sat in air that barely moved. No pressure differential reached it. The wind's assault was spent against the outer skin and dissipated in the cavity. The logs, instead of acting as thermal bridges conducting cold inward, sat in a zone of relative calm whose temperature stayed consistently 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the exterior air. Ice did not form on their inner surfaces. Heat generated by Peter's stove was not being continuously scavenged by infiltration. It accumulated the way heat is supposed to accumulate in a well-sealed space, building through the evening and holding through the night, with a persistence that required only a modest fire to maintain. Peter's interior temperature on the second morning of the blizzard, 59 degrees. His stove had been banked since midnight, running on coals not actively fed. His water pail showed no ice. The water lines he had run through an interior chase, identical in construction to Cordholt's, had not frozen. He dressed in his normal indoor clothes, ate his breakfast, and went out to check his livestock with the particular calm of a man whose house is doing exactly what he designed it to do. He kept his temperature records the way he kept all his records, systematically, without embellishment. On the 4th morning of the storm, with exterior temperatures reading 14 below zero and winds still sustained above 35 miles per hour, he noted the paired measurements in his ledger. Outer wall surface reading, 14 below. Interior log wall surface reading, 7 above. a differential of 21 degrees maintained not by a roaring fire, but by trapped air and a second wall that his neighbors had called a fence around a house. The first man to come was Walt Decker on the third day, when his wood supply had dropped below what he calculated he needed to finish the winter, even at reduced consumption. He had burned nearly 3 full cords in less than 72 hours trying to maintain survivable indoor temperatures, and the storm showed no intention of relenting. His wife had taken their 2 children into the bedroom with every quilt they owned and was heating stones on the stove to put at the foot of their shared bed, a frontier strategy that worked well enough in ordinary cold, but was barely adequate against what the blizzard was doing to a single-wall cabin. Walt arrived at Peter's outer door looking like a man who had walked 3 miles through a horizontal wall of ice crystals, which was exactly what he had done. He pushed through the outer door, which opened easily, its hinges protected by the outer wall's overhang, and stood for a moment in the cavity space before Peter opened the inner door, blinking against the relative warmth the way people blink against light after darkness. The difference was physical, not just measurable. Walt could feel it before he stepped through the inner door. The cavity was cold, certainly, but dead still, no wind at all, just the muffled roar of the storm working on the outer planks, and the air that came out when Peter opened the inner door was warm and dry and smelled of wood smoke and coffee in a way that Walt's own cabin hadn't smelled in 2 days because he'd been burning too much wood too fast to cook anything that required time. Peter stepped back without ceremony, and Walt came in. He stood in the center of the room and looked at the thermometer on the wall. 57 degrees. He looked at Peter's water pail, open on the table with no ice on the surface. He looked at the stove, which had a modest fire in it, not the roaring full-feed burn that he'd been running at home to no avail. He looked at the wood stacked near the stove and made the calculation a man makes when he has been burning 3 times as much to achieve half as much warmth. "How?" Walt said. "Just that one word." Peter poured him coffee and explained the principle in the same practical language he would have used to explain a well-designed harness or a properly balanced plow. The outer wall breaks the wind. The fill catches whatever gets through and holds it still. Moving air steals heat. Still air keeps it. The inner wall never sees the storm. He drew it on a scrap of paper with a carpenter's pencil, showing the 2 layers and the cavity, labeling the fill depth and the vent slots and the drainage gap at the base. Walt looked at the drawing for a long time. "I called it a fence around a house," Walt said finally. "It is a fence around a house," Peter said. "That's the whole idea." Walt's family moved in that evening. He had ridden home and brought them back through the storm. His wife and 2 children bundled in everything warm they owned, loaded onto the sled, because the alternative was burning furniture by the end of the week with no guarantee the cabin would stay above freezing anyway. They crowded into Peter's cabin with their bedrolls and their emergency provisions and their fractured pride, and Peter added a split log to his modest fire and made room without making a point of it. Burke Strand arrived on the 4th day, which surprised Peter because Burke was the kind of man who would endure considerable personal suffering before conceding that someone else had solved a problem he had declared solved. His cabin was in genuine trouble. The ice forming on the interior wall surfaces had grown thick enough to affect the chinking. The freeze-thaw cycling of moisture in the log joints was opening microscopic gaps that hadn't existed at the start of the storm, and each gap made the infiltration slightly worse, which dropped the interior temperature slightly further, which caused more ice formation, which opened more gaps. It was a failure mode that no amount of fire could reverse once it was established, because the problem wasn't heat generation. It was heat loss that no single wall could stop once a blizzard had found its way into the structure's seams. Burke did not apologize when he came. He didn't have to. The fact of his arrival said everything. He stood in Peter's cabin, now holding 5 adults and 2 children in a space meant for one family, and studied the construction details with the careful eyes of a man who builds well and knows it, acknowledging the thing that had been built better. "The vents at the top," he said after a while. "Why?" "Moisture," Peter said. "If the fill gets wet, it compresses. Compressed fill loses its air pockets. You vent the cavity so any moisture vapor can escape upward before it saturates the material. Pack it right and vent it right, and the fill stays dry for 2 or 3 winters before it needs replacing." Burke nodded slowly, the way a craftsman nods when he recognizes a solution that works on multiple levels at once. Not just the obvious one, but the secondary problems that the obvious solution creates. He pulled out his own small notebook and wrote something down. Peter pretended not to notice. Cordholt was the last to come on the 5th day, and his arrival cost him the most in terms of the identity he had built on these plains. He had been here longer than anyone. He had survived winters that had sent other men back east. His house was the largest and by every conventional measure, the best constructed in the area, and his pipes had frozen in it in a storm that a Belgian immigrant who had been on the prairie for less than a year was riding out in shirt sleeves with a modest fire and a wood supply that was going to last the rest of the season. He came in the late afternoon, alone, leaving his family huddled around a failing fire at home because he needed to see for himself before he asked. He looked at everything with a slow, systematic thoroughness. The outer door, the cavity space, the fill material visible through a gap in the baseboard screen, the ventilation slots under the eave, the hinged window shutters. He ran his hand along the inner log wall and felt what Burke had felt. No frost, no condensation, no ice, just wood at room temperature, insulated from the storm by 12 inches of dry hay and the physics of stillness. "How much wood have you burned?" he asked. Peter opened his ledger and showed him. Cord studied the numbers without speaking for almost a full minute. He had burned through more than 4.5 cords in 5 days trying to keep his pipes from refreezing and his bedroom above the threshold of safety. Peter had burned just under half a cord in the same period while maintaining consistent interior temperatures and hosting 5 refugees in addition to his own family. "What would it take to build one?" Cord said. Not could he build one, or should he, just the practical question of what it would require, from a man who had decided that the answer was yes before he finished asking. Peter gave him the measurements: 12-inch minimum cavity, cedar pickets at 36-inch spacing for the outer frame, ledger blocks every 48 inches to keep the frame true, 1x10 rough-sawn boards for the skin, 1x3 battens at every seam, half-inch vent slots under the eave, woven wire screening at the base gap, dry fill packed to 3 to 4 pounds per cubic foot, loose enough to hold air, dense enough to stay put, muslin wind check tacked at the top of each wall section to prevent settling. The whole system could go up in 2 weeks on a standing cabin if a man had the lumber and wasn't too proud to explain to his neighbors why he was doing what the Belgian had done the year before. "I'll need help getting my family over here tonight," Cord said. "I know," Peter said, and reached for his coat. The blizzard broke on the morning of the 7th day, the wind dropping from its sustained scream to irregular gusts, and then to a stillness so complete that the silence itself felt like an event. The landscape it left behind was transformed beyond recognition. Drifts reaching eave height on the north sides of structures, fence lines buried entirely, the familiar shapes of the territory smoothed into curves and planes that looked more like a sculptor's work than a winter storm's. The settlement took stock slowly, emerging from doors that opened into snow walls, digging paths between buildings, checking on livestock that had survived the cold in states ranging from discomfort to death. The damage was tallied in wood consumed, pipes thawed, animals lost, and in the bone-deep exhaustion of men and women who had spent 7 days fighting their own structures for warmth. Cord Holt had burned through 6 cords in 7 days. His pipes had frozen twice. His north bedroom wall had accumulated 1.5 inches of ice on its interior face that took 3 days after the storm to fully melt, leaving a damp stain in the chinking that would need to be repointed come spring. Burke Strand had burned through 4.5 cords and kept his family adequately warm, which was a better result than most, but he understood now the difference between adequate and stable. His cabin had responded to every fluctuation in wind speed and direction, with corresponding drops and spikes in interior temperature, a reactive relationship between structure and weather that demanded constant fire management and left no margin for an unbanked stove or an extra hour of sleep. Walt Decker had burned through 5.25 cords before abandoning his cabin on the 3rd day, which meant he had arrived at Pieter's with his winter wood supply already mortally compromised. Pieter Voss had burned through 1 cord and 3/4 across 7 days, including the additional heat load of hosting 9 people for the final 4 days of the storm. His interior temperature had never dropped below 54 degrees. His pipes had not frozen. His inner wall surfaces showed no frost, no ice, no moisture damage. His fill material was dry and intact. The outer planks had taken a beating. Some battens had worked loose at the top, and the windward face had developed a gray, weathered look that would need 2 new boards before the following winter. But that was cosmetic damage to a sacrificial surface, exactly as designed. The story of what had happened in those 7 days spread through Custer County with the particular velocity of information that changes the way people build things. Not gossip exactly. Something more useful and more stubborn than gossip. Cord Holt telling the hardware man in Broken Bow what his pipes had done and then what Pieter's hadn't. Burke Strand mentioning cavity dimensions at the mill when he ordered lumber for his spring retrofit. Walt Decker describing the feeling of walking from the blizzard's force into the dead-still cavity space, that moment of absolute wind cessation, as the most physically eloquent demonstration he had ever experienced of what a wall was actually supposed to accomplish. Martha Holt, who had spent 4 of the 7 storm days in Pieter's cabin with her children, and was not a woman given to understatement, told 3 women at Sunday services that the difference between the 2 cabins was not a matter of degree, but of kind. That sitting in Pieter's cabin during that blizzard was not merely warmer than sitting in her own. It was qualitatively different, stable in a way that single-wall construction could not be, because the storm outside could not reach the air inside, and air that cannot be reached cannot be stolen. That phrase circulated through the territory for the better part of a year. Air that cannot be reached cannot be stolen. People applied it to walls the way it was said, and they also turned it over in quieter moments and found that it carried a broader meaning that had nothing specific to do with insulation. Something about the wisdom of building a layer between what you value and what can take it from you. By the spring of 1885, 6 homesteaders within riding distance of Pieter's claim had placed lumber orders for outer wall construction. The dimensions varied. Some built their cavities at 10 inches, one man pushed to 14. And the fill materials reflected what was locally available. Sawdust from the Broken Bow mill proving more durable than hay over multiple seasons, a mixture of dry moss and fine wood shavings showing excellent results when properly vented. But the core principle was consistent across every adaptation: outer skin, dead air cavity, inner wall, the storm's surface, the buffer zone, the protected interior. The county agricultural agent, a man named Stillwater, who had been documenting construction practices since 1881, wrote the details into his annual report with careful precision, noting that the double wall method had demonstrated performance advantages during extreme weather events that appeared to justify the additional material cost and construction time. He included Peter's paired temperature measurements from his storm ledger, the outer wall to inner wall differentials that held between 17 and 23 degrees across 7 days of sustained blizzard conditions. He included Cord Holt's wood consumption figures alongside Peter's. He included Martha Holt's description of the qualitative difference, which he quoted without attribution because he recognized it as the kind of observation that deserved to stand on its own. The report was read in Lincoln and forwarded to the Territorial Land Office. A correspondent for an agricultural publication in Omaha picked it up and wrote an article that described the Belgian immigrant's method in enough detail that a carpenter in western Kansas could replicate it from the text alone. The article mentioned the ice house origins of the principle, which gave it a credibility that strictly frontier innovation sometimes lacked. This was not improvised desperation, but proven industrial practice adapted by a man who understood the physics involved and the problem he was solving. Peter was asked the following spring whether he had been bothered by the mockery during those 6 weeks of construction. The question came from Burke Strand, who was the most honest of the men who had come to him during the storm, and who asked it as a genuine inquiry rather than a flattery. "My father used to say," Peter answered, "that the ice doesn't care who believes in the sawdust." Burke wrote that down too. The physics that Peter had borrowed from Belgian ice storage and applied to a Nebraska homestead became, over the following decades, the foundation of a principle that modern building science would eventually call thermal envelope design. The idea is straightforward in retrospect and was straightforward at the time to anyone who had watched summer heat fail to reach winter ice through a packed sawdust wall. The function of insulation is not to generate warmth, but to prevent its theft. Mass alone cannot do this against pressurized wind. Density alone cannot do this if that density allows air to circulate through it. What works is stillness, fibrous material that traps air in millions of tiny, immobile pockets, each one a tiny dead zone where convective transfer cannot occur, multiplied across the depth of a cavity until the cumulative resistance exceeds what any storm can overcome. A log wall in 1884, properly chinked and well constructed, provided approximately R 1.5 per inch of thickness. A 10-inch log offered roughly R 15 total, which was adequate in calm cold but catastrophically insufficient against pressurized infiltration at 40 miles per hour. Dry, loose hay in a 12-inch cavity, properly vented to prevent moisture accumulation, delivered somewhere between R2 and R3 per inch under ideal packing conditions, roughly R24 to R36 across the full cavity width. But more importantly, it delivered this resistance against moving air rather than just cold temperatures. The outer wall's function was not primarily thermal but mechanical. It broke the wind's pressure before that pressure could drive infiltration through any gap in any surface. The combination, outer sacrificial skin, fibrous dead air cavity, protected inner wall, created a system in which the storm and the living space occupied the same physical location but entirely different thermal realities. 14 below zero outside, 7 above at the inner log face, 21 degrees of separation created by 12 inches of dry hay and the absence of circulating air. No single wall can do that. No chinking, however careful, can do that in a sustained blizzard. The physics don't permit it, and the storm doesn't care how carefully the mortar was applied, or how experienced the builder was, or how many winters he had survived with the same method. What the storm cares about, to the extent that weather can be said to care about anything, is gaps, and a second wall, properly built and properly filled, gives the storm a surface full of gaps to find and spend itself against before it reaches anything that matters. Pieter Voss knew this because his father had watched ice survive July in a building designed on the same principle. He built it into his cabin not out of stubbornness or foreign eccentricity, but because he understood that the problem he was solving was identical to the problem the icehouse operators had already solved, and that there was no reason to learn the same physics twice from scratch when the lesson had already been paid for. The fence around the house kept the air still. The still air kept the heat. The heat kept the family warm while the blizzard did what blizzards do to everything it could reach. And the outer planks took that and weathered it and gave the inner wall its quiet. That's the whole idea. That was always the whole idea. If this kind of story stays with you, the outsider who understood the physics that everyone else dismissed, make sure you subscribe. Every week we go back into the historical record and pull out the people whose knowledge was called foolish, right up until the moment it kept someone alive. There are more of them than you'd think, and every single one of them understood something worth knowing.